Week 3 of the fantasy football season. Here's a few players I look to buy and trade for this week. The first player, Jamar Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals, for the first 2 weeks of the season with no training camp really, under the weather in week 1. And then week 2, he lost his cool at times, is Jamar Chase. He hasn't done much, and he was a first-round pick, obviously, in every fantasy league is Jamar Chase. So Jamar Chase, we know he's a great talent. We know one of the better receivers in all pro football. And now the next 2 weeks, he's got great matchups coming up versus the Commanders and at the Carolina Panthers. So after 2 bad weeks to his standards for Jamar Chase, he's a buy low candidate. I still believe you're going to have to pay a decent price to get him. But Jamar Chase owners say they're 0-2, and obviously they used the first-round pick on him. They're going to be very frustrated and maybe try to trade him off. So Jamar Chase, after 2 bad weeks, he's a buy low player this week. Next player, Travis Kelce of the Kansas City Chiefs. Travis Kelce, 34 years old. And I know I said this coming into the year. I think this might be the last big season for Kelce, and then he's really going to start to fall off. But so far, first 2 weeks of the season, he hasn't done much. He's not even had double-digit fantasy points combined in the first 2 weeks. So Kelce, week 1, only 6.40 fantasy points on 3 catches, 34 yards. And week 2, non-existent, 1 catch, 5 yards in that ball game where he just got stopped on the goal line on that shuffle pass. So right now he's struggling mightily, is Travis Kelce, but he's a veteran. And once him and Mahomes get in the zone, these guys are possibly the best quarterback receiving option in the league. So now with 2 easier matchups coming up in Atlanta and the Chargers, so be the time to pounce and get Travis Kelce on your team, because if he goes out there and breaks out, it's going to be too late and you have to pay top price to get Kelce. The next player, Amari Cooper of the Cleveland Browns. For the first 2 weeks, it hasn't been good at all for Amari Cooper, where week 1, non-existent, 3.5 fantasy points, dropped a touchdown, where would have salvaged your day. And then week 2, in a good matchup at Jacksonville, on paper, he didn't do anything at all as Amari Cooper. 3 catches, 11 yards. The only thing I'll say, the targets are there. And Deshaun Watson, he did look better in week 2 versus the Jaguars. But right now, Amari Cooper, he was playing better last season with Joe Flacco and Thompson Robinson, were quarterbacks that he never played with before. And with Deshaun Watson, he's played more games with Watson than those other quarterbacks I mentioned. And he just can't get anything going. But the next couple weeks, better matchups coming up for Cooper. Week 3 versus the Giants. Week 4 at the Raiders. And week 5 at Washington. All beatable secondaries. And Amari Cooper, we've seen this. With his games, he disappears and doesn't do much. And then there's games he goes out there and he could drop 40, 50 fantasy points. And we've seen it at times with Amari Cooper. So right now, where he's another player that hasn't combined it for double digits in the first 2 games, he's a great buy low candidate this week. The next player, another receiver, Brandon Aiyuk of the San Francisco 49ers. A lot of receivers out of the gate are slow this year, not putting up numbers. And Brandon Aiyuk, week 1, we saw drop the touchdown versus the New York Jets. He had no impact in that game, 2 catches, 28 yards. And in week 2 at Minnesota, only 4 catches, 43 yards. So the next couple weeks, his schedule gets a little bit better. Week 3 at the Rams and week 4 versus the New England Patriots. And this San Francisco 49er team, they had a dominant performance versus the New York Jets in week 1. Week 2, get upset big time at the Minnesota Vikings. I think they're going to bounce back with a vengeance. Brandon Aiyuk, he's not up to snuff as well, where he sat out all the training camp. And those training camp reps, veteran, rookie, or whatever, those are important reps. And obviously it's shown with Jamar Chase in the early going. It's shown with Brandon Aiyuk, and even to a certain extent it showed with CeeDee Lamb, where he's had one mid-game, and if he didn't get that 65-yard touchdown was Lamb. He didn't do much in week 2. So right now, these guys, they sat out training camp, and now it's catching up to them. But they're buy low players, and I think they're going to start getting things going sooner than later. So this San Francisco 49er team, after a bad loss in a game they were expected to win easily, I think Brandon Aiyuk bounces back and he starts getting his legs under him. Next buy low is Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets. Garrett Wilson last season with no quarterback play with Zach Wilson and Tim Boyle went out there and put up numbers. But so far in the early going the season, it's been 2 middle-of-the-pack games in PPR leagues. Week 1 in San Francisco, 6 catches, 60 yards. And week 2 with Tennessee, 4 catches, 57 yards for Garrett Wilson and a rush for 4 yards in that one. So Garrett Wilson's a great talent. He was a first-round, early second-round pick. I wasn't that big on him going into the year. And I'm still not highly on Garrett Wilson, but I didn't think his numbers would be this low in the early going for Garrett Wilson. So right now, well, he hasn't performed, and many people thought he would take off right away with Aaron Rodgers at quarterback. He's a buy low candidate. And Aaron Rodgers, he's another player where he's got to get his legs under him. Coming off an Achilles injury at 40 years old, And obviously his mobility was going as it was. It's tough for Aaron Rodgers to be consistent week in and week out. But Garrett Wilson, like I said, we've seen it the last couple seasons with poor quarterback play, still go out there and put up huge numbers and have over 1,000 yards. So right now, while he's off to a slow start, not a terrible start, just a slow start. He's a buy low player this week. The next buy is Jaylen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins. So obviously Waddle and Tyreek Hill owners are panicking with Tua now out for who knows how long. And Skylar Thompson, what they saw from him coming into that game, he could have moved the football down the field. So Jaylen Waddle, week 1, big ball game, over 100 yards. And then week 2 versus the Bills, he didn't do anything. And it was just the way the Bills played defense. 2 safeties back, and they tried Devon A-Chain in the running game to beat him. And I think a lot of teams are going to do that, try to take Tyreek Hill and Waddle's deep ball out and try the running game to beat them, opposing teams, and let Miami work the field, dinking and dunking, instead of hitting that big 60, 70-yard play. So right now, with fantasy owners definitely panicking with 2 out, and Jaylen Waddle not doing much in week 2 versus Buffalo. I think he's a buy low candidate, and he's a talented wide receiver. I believe no matter who the quarterback is, he's still going to go out there, make plays, and put up numbers. I'm not saying he's going to put up the numbers like he would with Tua, but still be a solid number 2 wide receiver at worst for fantasy owners. And the final play I look to buy and trade for is Michael Pittman of the Indianapolis Colts. So it's not working so far for Michael Pittman with Anthony Richardson, where Richardson likes stretching the field and hitting his deep ball targets, where we know Michael Pittman's an intermediate route runner and a guy who's going to work on slants and cross routes in the middle of the field, but not really be a deep ball threat, where we've seen Alec Pierce have success and Adonai Mitchell getting targeted deep for Michael Pittman. So Michael Pittman, the first 2 weeks, he's done nothing as well. Week 1 versus Houston, 4 catches, 31 yards. And week 2 with the Packers, 3 catches, 21 yards on 7 targets. So Pittman was a 4th or 5th rounder in most fantasy drafts. And him and Anthony Richardson, they're just not on the same page right now. But Michael Pittman owners are definitely frustrated. I still believe he's a receiver that could turn things around, where his matchups weren't all that great as well in the first 2 weeks of the year. So Michael Pittman, since he's done nothing, and he was a pretty highly touted pick coming into drafts, like I said, 3rd, 4th round range, maybe the 5th at worst. He's a buy low player this week. So that's a few plays I look to buy and trade for week 3 of the fantasy football season.